Good afternoon. My name is Al Goethals. I'm a professor in the Jepson School of Leadership Studies. And as someone who teaches presidential leadership, it's my great pleasure to introduce Attorney General Edwin Meese III, former counselor to the President and Attorney General during the 2 terms of Ronald Reagan's administrations. Mr. Meese is here under the auspices of the Jepson School's Leader in Residence initiative, which brings distinguished visitors to the Jepson School for several days to meet with students, attend classes, and give public lectures or performances. Past visitors include Leo Thorsness, Medal of Honor winner and jet fighter pilot in Vietnam, Leland Melvin, one of University of Richmond's own, who played in the NFL and was an astronaut with NASA, and Patricia Brown, who was president of Johns Hopkins Healthcare. It's a great pleasure to introduce the 75th Attorney General of the United States and currently Ronald Reagan Chair in Public Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Meese is a Yale alumnus and earned his law degree at the University of California, Berkeley. He served in the U.S. Army and is currently a retired colonel in the Army Reserve. Mr. Meese is most noted for his role in the Reagan administration as both Counselor to the President and Attorney General. He wrote the definitive story of the Reagan administration from the point of view of someone who saw it up close and very personal in his book, With Reagan, The Inside Story. In his role as Attorney General, Mr. Meese focused on combating terrorism, drug trafficking, and organized crime. His 2009 book, Leadership, Ethics, and Policing, reflects his expertise on the issues involved in his lecture today, The Post-Ferguson World, The Challenges of Police and Community. After the Attorney General makes his remarks, we will have some time for discussion, and I will ask people to address questions to Mr. Meese standing in line at either of these microphones at the front of the room so that we can all hear what you are asking. Before turning it over to Mr. Meese, I would just like to mention his special generosity to the University of Richmond. He spoke here at a Federalist Society dinner in 2006 and then co-taught a course on the Reagan administration with Professor Gary McDowell in 2007, making the trip down to Richmond from DC every Friday and bringing distinguished guests. And I suppose you could say that his generosity extended to the tuition checks he wrote for 4 years to the University of Richmond during the years that his daughter was a student here in the class of 1989. Please join me in welcoming Attorney General Edwin Meese III.
Thank you very much, Professor Goethals, and ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. I have great regard for this institution, as you heard from what the professor mentioned about my past associations, and it's particularly good to be here today to talk about this subject at the Jepson School of Leadership, because there's no topic, I think, that's more important today in terms of leadership than what's going on in the law enforcement field. And so in talking about the post-Ferguson world and police in the community, I think we all recognize how much has been in the paper, even to the point that today the Richmond Times-Dispatch has a summary of the report by the Department of Justice on the Ferguson Police Department, and just recently it also had a kind of a forum by the police chiefs locally when they were talking about some of the issues that I'll be discussing today. Well, as we all can remember, on noon on Saturday, the 9th of August, 2014, in an encounter with police officer Darren Wilson of the Ferguson, Missouri Police Department, a young black man, Michael Brown, was shot and killed by the officer. And thus began one of what I would say one of the most publicized incidents involving police and the public that we've seen in recent years. The story of the event, and particularly its aftermath, are well known to, I'm sure, most of you, but it does provide us, I would suggest, an opportunity to learn from a terrible situation and perhaps to improve the operations of police in the United States to talk about their relationships with the citizens that they serve. For over 6 months, our country has had a torrent of accusations, commentary, magazine and newspaper stories, radio and television discussions, all of which was aimed at, and I would say some of it based on fact, some on rumor, but aimed on what was delivered, what went on really in Ferguson, but also a topic that necessarily was delivered in an atmosphere of very high emotion and very volatile rhetoric. We have seen the many instances of riot and demonstrations and protests that have taken place during this period of time. During that time, since the August time in 2014, there was an extensive hearing by the grand jury in Missouri, in which they found that Darren Wilson had indeed acted in self-defense and had not committed any crime. And if you remember, that brought forward, again, after the event itself erupting in violence, then again there were violent protests when that report came in. Many times after that original event, and particularly after the publication of that grand jury report, you had the looting, the arson, and the other incidents that took place in which many people were injured, particularly police officers. And then more recently, on the 4th of March, just a few weeks ago, the Department of Justice, after having conducted an extensive investigation, at one time it was estimated they had 50 FBI agents working on it, they have provided a report which agreed with the Missouri grand jury essentially and exonerated Darren Wilson. As a matter of fact, the Justice Department report said the following. It said, Wilson's account of what happened is corroborated by physical evidence, and that his perception of a threat posed by Brown is corroborated by other eyewitnesses. There is no credible evidence, they said, that Wilson willfully shot Brown as he was attempting to surrender or was otherwise not posing a threat to the police officer. Well, most of the uproar that took place around the country was quite frankly based on a myth that was begun by an accomplice of Brown who had been with him that earlier, just prior to the encounter with the police officer, during the commission by the two of a strong-arm robbery of a convenience store. And so this companion, probably to take any blame away from himself or any dealings with the police as far as he was concerned, loudly proclaimed at the scene and later that Brown had had his arms up in surrender and that the police officer shot him in the back. Well, this was, as you now know, a lie. He did not have his hands up in surrender, and he was not shot in the back, as the autopsy and all the evidence proved, and as was proved also by a number of other eyewitnesses. But unfortunately, it was that lie, if you will, that caused the explosion of anger and violence that shook the country and caused the spread of protest, even to the point of college students, in a couple of cases, even professional sports figures and others going around raising their hands and shouting, hands up, don't shoot, which became kind of a rallying cry for those who desired to engage in the protests. The reaction, unfortunately, was incited by many instigators who had their own motives, some political, some otherwise, including numerous outsiders, such as the infamous Al Sharpton, who came to Ferguson to arouse the crowd, as well as some politicians around the country who, for their own political purposes, sought to use this event and this situation for whatever purposes they might have. I would suggest to you that some of the worst criminals in the whole saga were those who engaged in the violence, the arson, the vandalism, and the looting that took place in that community, where many citizens who had trying to, modest incomes, were trying to earn a living, found that their shops and their property was vandalized, or in many cases their buildings burned to the ground, where they had to start over. And unfortunately, many of those criminals that were involved in that will never be caught or never punished. The most serious victims, I would suggest, are the innocent citizens, the property owners who lost everything that they had commercially in those riots and demonstrations that took place. There were also some collateral events, of course, taking place elsewhere during this period of time. In New York City, a very large man who was resisting arrest died during that incident there. There were various protests that started there, and this incident in New York City added to the furor. Sadly, 2 police officers in New York City were ambushed and were assassinated by a person who obviously had been incited and who had been influenced by the events that were taking place, the protests around the country. During the rioting in Ferguson, also, more recently, 2 other police officers were shot and wounded. Incidentally, it's kind of interesting to put forward as counterpoint that during this same 7-month period, a police officer was shot and killed during trying to stop a robbery in Philadelphia, and another police officer in Georgia was killed in an ambush. In contrast to what went on in Ferguson, there were no protests, there were no riots. As a matter of fact, neither of those incidents, sad and tragic as they also were, made the national news. Well, the 7 months from August 2014 to the beginning of this month, I would suggest is one of the saddest chapters of police-community relations in the modern history of the country. And so the question really in addressing this topic today is how do we recover from the series of tragedies that took place during this 7-month period? What can we learn? How can we determine what should be done really to remedy the situation, the relationship between police and the communities that they serve? And that's what I'd like to talk about today, because I believe there is a great deal of constructive things that can be done, lessons learned from this, but also going beyond that, and having real discussions about the work of policing, what the police have the right to expect from the community, and also what the community has the right to expect from the police, and what can be learned from things that went well or didn't go well in these incidents that I mentioned earlier. The first step, of course, is to recognize that there is a problem. James Comey, who is the director of the FBI, gave an excellent speech recently discussing this whole thing at Georgetown University. And he said this, he said, "Unfortunately, in places like Ferguson and New York City, and in some communities across the nation, there is a disconnect between police agencies and many citizens, predominantly in communities of color." He went on to say, "Serious debates are taking place about how law enforcement personnel relate to the communities they serve, about the appropriate use of force, and about real and perceived biases, both within and outside of law enforcement. These are important debates," he said. "Every American should feel free to express an informed opinion, to protest peacefully, to convey frustration and even anger in a constructive way. That's what makes our democracy great. Those conversations," he said, "as bumpy and uncomfortable as they can be, help us understand different perspectives and better serve our communities. Of course, these are only conversations in the true sense of that word if we are willing not only to talk, but to listen as well." And I think the important things to take out of Director Comey's remarks are that it's important that people express informed opinions and also that they're willing to listen. Well, as we take heart from what Director Comey said, it's good to know what is going on and recognize the problem, to see what is happening around the country that can help us to solve the problem. President Obama appointed a task force on 21st century policing, which has just recently completed its work. There were some at the time that thought that this was some kind of a political stunt, but I can assure you, having read the report, that this is one of the best commissions that I've seen working on this issue in some 50 years of working in the criminal justice community. They got the right people to head it. They had Charles Ramsey, formerly the Chief of Police in Washington, D.C., now the Commissioner of Police in Philadelphia, and Professor Lori Robinson, who's Professor of Criminology at George Mason University, and who has a long history of, she was an Assistant Attorney General during the early part of this, or actually during the early term of President Obama, but has been working in police matters and law enforcement matters, criminal law, for the American Bar Association and for other organizations for the past 20 or 25 years. So they got the right people. And then they did the right thing in terms of having listening sessions. They brought together some of the best chiefs of police, some of the best community representatives, people from victims groups, civic leaders, people from minority organizations, and they did listen. And I read some of the excerpts from the various sessions. They had sessions all over the country where they listened to these people. And so having the ideas of some of the best minds, they provided an excellent report, some 101 pages, which provides numerous recommendations and action items that can be utilized to deal with the problems that were reflected in Ferguson. One of the first suggestions that they talked about was building trust and legitimacy. They said that building trust and nurturing legitimacy on both sides of the police and citizen divide is one of the best ways in order to provide a sound foundation for citizens and the police to work together and to have a peaceful and constructive community. And the report talked about legitimacy of policing comes from procedurally just behavior on the part of police officers based on 4 central principles. First, treating people with dignity and respect. Secondly, giving individuals voice even during encounters. Third, being neutral and transparent in decision-making. And fourth, conveying trustworthy motives. And they went on to say that research demonstrates that these principles lead to relationships in which the community trusts that officers are honest, unbiased, benevolent, and lawful. The community, therefore, feels obligated to follow the law and the dictates of legal authorities and is more willing to cooperate with and engage those authorities because it believes that it shares a common set of interests and values with the police. You know, this really is not a new idea. And I know the police officers in the audience would agree. It goes all the way back to the middle 1800s when Sir Robert Peel in London, who founded the London Metropolitan Police, established his principles of policing and said about the same things that I just read from the task force report about the importance of the police and the public being one, if you will, in purpose, one in cooperation, and one in trust for each other. Well, the second suggestion, I would say, is that it's important that we have the information on which to make changes, on which to make improvements, and on which to develop a working relationship between police and the public. And here, again, going back to Director Comey, when he was talking about the importance of data, the importance of information. And he said the first step to understanding what is really going on in our communities and in our country is to gather more and better data related to those that we arrest, those we confront for breaking the law and jeopardizing public safety, and those who confront us. Data, he said, seems a dry and boring word. And those of you like me who hated statistics when we went through college would probably agree. But really, without it, he said, we cannot understand our world and make it better. And he went on to say, how can we address the concerns about use of force, for example? How can we address concerns about officer-involved shootings if we do not have a reliable grasp on the demographics and the circumstances of those incidents? We simply must improve the way we collect and analyze data to see the true nature of what's happening in all of our communities. Well, the other side of the coin from getting facts, of course, is for the public and the news media to be careful not to jump to conclusions when they don't have the facts. And certainly the Ferguson situation is a good example, and that is why, as in that case, myths and untruths can actually be the basis for tragic and unfortunate actions when people don't have all the facts. And certainly it enables those who would to exaggerate the situation or condemn all police, as some people, unfortunately, even in that situation, have tried to do. Ferguson provides an example, but it's important that to beware of those who engage in what I would call political opportunism or otherwise utilize situations like that without the facts and then smear police officers across the country. There's no question in my mind, having worked with police officers for many, many years, to realize that the work of police officers is probably the most difficult of any profession that we have, and often is the least appreciated by the people that they serve. If most of us are honest, we'll say that most contact that people have with the police are too often, from our personal standpoints, negative. It's getting a traffic ticket, or having an officer tell us to move our car, that it's blocking something, or when to move away from a particular scene of something going on. And the chance to have positive actions are even less for many of the people who are in the low-income neighborhoods within our cities. And so that is why the public also has a responsibility to provide dignity and respect to police officers in the same manner that they in turn have the responsibility of providing dignity and respect for the citizens they serve. Well, I think we all have to recognize that safe and lawful communities goes beyond the police themselves. Indeed, it's a responsibility for the entire criminal justice system. And one of the problems that they had in Ferguson, for example, was a court system which was somewhat oppressive in gaining revenue from citizens, and that the town fathers, the public officials of the town, relied heavily on the revenues that came from fines and forfeitures that were administered by the court system there. And that was one of the underlying problems there that provided some basis or some reasons why the community had a negative attitude toward what was going on in their community. And that's why the International Association of Chiefs of Police, which represent virtually all the police departments in the country, have called in the past and call today for a National Commission on Criminal Justice to address the challenges and develop across-the-board improvements in our entire criminal justice system. And when we're talking about the criminal justice system, we're talking about the courts, we're talking about the correctional agencies, we're talking about the legislators who make the laws, we're talking about all of those involved in providing the legal framework within which people try to project a safe and a constructive life. And so that, again, is one of the things that would be helpful. One of the things that we have in the United States is a great desire among our people to have local law enforcement. It's interesting, in Britain, for example, there's no police agency, no police force there that has less than 1,000 officers. We have very few officers that have more, very few police agencies that have more than 100. Over 50% of all police departments in the United States have 25 officers or less. Very few have well over 1,000 or more. And so the fact that we have a fairly fragmented police system in the United States, which the citizens like. They like the ability to know their local police chief. They like the ability to be able to complain at the local police station. But at the same time, we recognize that those provide limitations then in doing some of the things necessary in training, in providing backup, in providing adequate officers, in providing investigation and the like. And also, we have severe limitations of budgets as far as police departments are concerned. I don't think there's a single police department in the United States of any size at all that hasn't pared back the number of officers that they have on the street and the total size of their agencies over the course of the last 10 years for budgetary reasons. And as a result, then, a lot of the things, some of which I'll be talking about, and some of the things that are being recommended in the task force report are almost impossible to do because of police officers that are on the street rushing from call to call, trying to satisfy the needs of the people that are imminent and that are urgent, and which leave precious little time then for the things that would be helpful in terms of crime prevention and in terms of positive engagement with citizens of the community. Another recommendation, of course, is one that has been certainly magnified over the course of the last 2 decades, and that is the idea of community policing. It's one of those things that I mentioned in which it's very hard to find the resources to promote it, but it's an absolute essential in order to maintain not just a good relationship between police and the public, but also to engage the police in helping with crime prevention and in many cases with the solution of crime by providing information to the police, which aids in their investigations and their apprehension of wrongdoers. And so community policing needs to be infused throughout the culture and the organizational structure of law enforcement agencies, and to utilize the various techniques of community policing, which I believe is one of the 2 factors that has been primarily responsible for crime in the United States having been reduced considerably from its peak in the 1979-1980 period. During that period, prior to that time, from 1960 to 1980, the conventional wisdom in criminal justice circles was that people should not be sent to prison, that instead they should be put on probation or super probation or super probation, but almost anything to keep them from going to prison, no matter how bad or how frequently they seem to offend the law. When I was working for then Governor Reagan in 1971, we did a survey in California, and we found that less than 10% of all convicted felons, those guilty of the most serious crimes, were going to prison. Well, as a result, from 1960 to 1980, crime, violent crime, and ordinary and other types of crime, but all crime increased 300%. Violent crime increased 500% across the country. Some of you probably remember those days. In 1968, it became a major issue in the presidential campaign. During the early or mid-60s, President Johnson created a crime commission to deal with it. And another one was created by President Nixon in 1971. And so what happened was that legislatures started raising penalties and insisting that more and more convicted criminals be put in prison. And so as a result, starting really about the middle of the 1970s, more serious habitual offenders, those people who repeatedly committed crimes, were being sent to prison, and they were being sent there for longer periods of time. As a result, crime was reduced precipitously beginning around 1981 or 82. It went down for about 4 or 5 years. Then, unfortunately, in our major cities, crack cocaine became the drug of choice of some people, and as a result of that, the crime went up briefly, but never nearly as high as it had been previously. And then once drug abuse was considerably reduced under a strategy that was employed nationally during the 1980s, when we got to the 1990s, crime again continued to go down and has been reduced. It's still too high, but it certainly has been reduced from what it was. And community policing and increased incarceration of the serious habitual criminals are, I think, the 2 factors. And certainly community policing, where the police were cooperating or were receiving the cooperation of the public, was another factor. And when they were doing their work in a better way that was more satisfying to the public and engaged the public, these were the 2 factors that I believe was one of were the things that primarily led to the reduction in crime. Well, in developing community policing, there are several factors that go into it. One is, of course, allowing sufficient time for patrol officers to participate in problem solving and in community engagement, as I mentioned. Another is the police having regular forums and meetings with community leaders and with members of the community so that they can hear from the community what their desires, what their problems are, and also respond and let the community know what's going on. One of the things that's been very successful around the country have been citizen academies, where ordinary citizens are invited to spend a regular series of meetings with the police on a weekly basis for a period of 6 or 8 weeks, in which each week, in 2.5-hour sessions, they are acquainted with how the police operate, how they can be helpful in crime prevention, and things such as this. But it certainly brings the police and the public together. Another thing that is helpful, that has been tried in some places, is regular surveys of the public by the police. You know, we have surveys for everything. If you've been at home, you've been, I'm sure, called by people doing surveys for commercial marketing purposes. In some cities, they've used the same techniques to learn what the people feel about the police, how they think it can be better, ideas for improvement, and also things that people are concerned about as far as the police are concerned. And of course, another thing, part of the community policing has been citizen advisory committees meeting on a regular basis with police commanders so that there can be direct response from precinct and division commanders to police officers, to citizens in the neighborhood who have concerns or have questions about what their police officers are doing. Another thing that I believe is important is as to the police officers themselves and how the community regards them, and how the community and how the civic organizations, the municipalities and counties that employ them, how they in turn provide the training, the recruiting, and the other things that have to do with putting the best possible police officers out before the public. For example, recognizing the stature of police. Now, as a former military man, and I'm sure there are many in the audience here, we recognize the fact that people who fly airplanes, whether it's in the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, whatever it happens to be, and certainly in the Air Force, the people who fly the planes, even though they don't command large groups of personnel, they're given the stature of officers. They're second lieutenants or ensigns, whatever it happens to be, or warrant officers in the Army, not because of the number of people they command, but because of the tremendous responsibility they have. Airplanes that cost, in some cases, millions of dollars, but more than that, the lethal force that is in their command and under their control. And so for that reason, that's why, because of the responsibilities they have, we make them officers. Too often, police officers are thought of by the public more like privates in the Army or the Marine Corps or the lowest grade of enlisted person in the Navy. And that's where I think that stature and that understanding and recognition is important from the standpoint of the public, and also the way in which we should consider police officers, because they are the only representatives of the government that have the discretion and the responsibility of exercising legal force, plus lethal force in the course of their duties. Secondly, obviously, is training. And the training of police, and this is another thing where budget becomes a factor, and that is having the resources to provide training opportunities for police officers. Another part of that is how we train police officers. It was very interesting. In one of the listening sessions that the task force held, one of the participants said this. He said, "Why are we training police officers like soldiers? Although police officers wear uniforms and carry weapons, the similarity ends there. The mission and rules of engagement are completely different. The soldier's mission is that of a warrior, to conquer. The rules of engagement are decided before the battle. By contrast, the police officer's mission is that of a guardian, to protect. The rules of engagement evolve as the incident unfolds. Soldiers must follow orders. Police officers often have to make independent decisions. Soldiers come into communities often as an outside occupying force. Guardians, police officers, are members of the community, protecting them from within." Another aspect that I think goes a long ways to explaining how some improvements in the training of police can be made. Another, of course, is technology, bringing the best of technology for the benefit of police officers to do a better job. One of the things that has been tried successfully are cameras worn by police officers, or cameras in police cars that can provide a video, in some cases, and in other cases still photos, but mostly videos, moving pictures, if you will, of what goes on in particular incidents, or in some cases also audio recorders to record at least the conversations that are taking place between citizens and the officer. Now, these are not panaceas by any means, but they are in many ways a way in which the police officers themselves can be protected so that the true version of what went on in a particular encounter with a citizen can be presented, can even be used in court, and rather than have a he said or he said kind of encounter or presentation of proof before a judge, or even for the purpose of disciplinary hearings, so that the officer doing the right thing is protected. And the other, of course, are protective vests. Protective vests are usually in most police departments available, but some have not had the budget to provide them. And the reason why this is important is that the safer a police officer feels and is, the easier it is for him or her to be relaxed in their encounters with the citizens. And so that, too, is a factor, not just in the safety of the officer, although that's vitally important, but also in terms of improving the relationship that I talked about. And there is the idea of building a culture of police officer service and understanding on the part of the police. And as has been stated in one presentation on this subject, those in law enforcement must redouble their efforts in the face of the incidents that have occurred to resist bias and prejudice. They must better understand the people that they serve and protect, and they must approach all members of the community with respect and decency. And on the other hand, the public has a similar responsibility on their side of the divide, if you will, and that responsibility is to obey the lawful orders of police, to listen to police officers and understand what they are trying to do and why they are trying to do it, to understand the facts of the situations and not, as I mentioned earlier, jump to conclusions based upon the latest myth, the latest rumor, or the latest misunderstanding, or in some cases misstatement of what the facts really are. Well, these are just a number of ideas that are being talked about and thought about and in many cases beginning to be implemented. Some of them, matter of fact, most of them are not particularly new. Many police departments, and I'm sure many in this community here, are doing many of these things. But it is important that we kind of relearn these things, we re-examine these types of things, particularly when you have a situation that is present in the country today, where you have the fact that some have sown doubts and certainly there's a great deal of misunderstanding about the role of police, and particularly in some of our less affluent communities, the importance of getting this across to all of our citizens, particularly to young people in schools, to get people on college campuses, every place where the possibility of uprisings, where the possibility of misinformation, and where the possibility of improper reaction to police takes place, just as it's important that these same subjects be discussed in police circles themselves. But all of the ideas that I've mentioned, all the things that are engaged in the, that are involved in the task force report, all of the things that the police profession itself is trying to do, have one purpose, and that's to bring police and the public together. That has to be our goal, to build a safer and more just society and to benefit all of our people. Thank you.
All right, my name is Patricia Churchill, and my question is, what do you think about the apparently increasing militarization of the police and the tanks and so forth that they now have?
I think this is a very good question because a lot has been in the news media about it, and some of that information has not been correct. Now, there have been certain implements. Actually, these, I don't know of any tanks that have been given to police, but there are armored vehicles that have been provided to police, which are access to the wars that have taken place in Iraq and in Afghanistan. These kinds of vehicles have been around for a long time. I can remember seeing them as recently as 40 years ago in some police departments. And they have a purpose in law enforcement, and that is to protect police officers in certain situations, barricade situations, other situations where they need to go forward, but they also can be used in a way that is not proper and they can be overused in some situations. And so it's not the question of whether you have these particular pieces of equipment, it's how they're used. We all can remember how they were used in a tragic way some years ago in Waco when one of these military-type vehicles was improperly used, which started a fire, and as a result, a number of people were trapped. But that rarely happens. But I think a part of it is a matter of proper procedures for the department when they're used. Another part of it is how they're used and the limitations of their use and how they are worked and in what situations they are proper. Included in that is the fact that there are some types of vehicles, just because they're surplus, are being given to police agencies. I think, again, police have to think very carefully what they're going to use them for and whether they really need them or not in their particular department. But I think they have a purpose. The other part of that is that there are some situations where the police have to be properly equipped for the protection of the officers, but also enable them to rescue people and to be able to provide the necessary ability to go into certain types of buildings and into these barricade situations or hostage situations, because without the proper equipment, without the proper armament, there's no way that the officers can safely go in there, and if they can't get in safely, they can't rescue the people involved. At the same time, however, the SWAT teams, as they're known, Special Weapons and Tactics teams, there are some cases where police agencies have used them, overused them. We've had the situations where the newspapers play up quite a bit, where in one case I can remember where they had to kill a dog or something like that, or where people see them in what look like battle-type gear. Again, that should be used, and police commanders generally follow this only when the danger is there, when it's absolutely necessary. And I think everything should be used, every opportunity should be used by officers to resist looking like a military force unless it's absolutely necessary for the safety of the officers or the citizens they're working with. But I think it's a very good question for citizens to ask their local police when they talk with them, what do you use military-type equipment or special weapons for, and under what circumstances, so that the citizens know what it is, what is their policy on this, and how do they use them, because when they are needed, it's absolutely critical they have them. And I think it's important that departments make this information known to the public so that they resist legislation that would take these particularly important parts of their equipment away from them under all circumstances, because they may have been misused by some department someplace in a particular situation.
Hi. One quick follow-up to that, and then I have another question that
Sure.
is in the militarization answer you just gave. One of the things that I didn't hear mentioned was the difference between a militarization model and a community policing model is with the military you think of the people you're around as the enemy, whereas with a community policing model you're there to protect them and they're your friends. But the question I had was, how do you feel, what are your thoughts on citizens filming police and the resistance that they meet from police from that?
Yeah, how do I feel about citizens filming police? This is a fairly new subject in terms of law. There haven't been too many legal cases on the subject, but the most recent cases is that courts have upheld the right of citizens to film the police, just as they would be able to film anything else that is out in public. I think the questions that have to be looked at, though, is it's critical that the citizens not become film in a way that is obstructing the police officer in carrying out their duty. And part of this is proximity, how close do they get to the police officer in the situation. Secondly, are they doing something that's inflaming the situation and making it worse by filming or trying to film? Is it appropriate in the situation from the standpoint of the person being arrested? Do they have any rights not to be filmed by another citizen? All of these are issues that have to be worked out. But in general, the general answer is that in most cases, providing police that the citizens stay far enough away so they're not interfering or obstructing the police officer, that they're not becoming a part of the incident themselves, then I think that most citizens have the right to film police officers in the carrying out of their duty. But there are limitations to this that are both common sense and for the good of the people involved.
Hi. So I have a question about your incarceration. According to a current CBS news article, it costs over $64 billion of taxpayers' money each year for every person in prison. Is it possible that instead of putting people who commit nonviolent crimes into prison, but instead sending them to rehab or other kinds of treatment that would help them instead? And also, if we did that, then it would decrease the amount of money that we pay each year for incarceration. And if we did that, then perhaps that money could go towards the lack of policemen that, or women that you say we have. Okay,
a very good question. And I think, did you all hear the question? It was basically, if we put fewer people in prison, particularly for nonviolent offenses, wouldn't that be helpful to them, where they could go to rehabilitation centers and so on, and also save money? I think, yes, the answer is yes. However, one of the things that the press regularly does is exaggerate the amount of people, the number of people, and the reasons for people going to prison. I think every police officer and every judge would not have objection if, following what you're suggesting, would be doing something that would lessen crime. But also, the facts are that it's not easy to get to prison. It's not easy to get into prison. Most prison sentences, and there is no, for a nonviolent crime, what is a nonviolent crime? Certainly a robbery is a violent crime. Certainly a burglary, a house invasion is a violent crime. Certainly burglary, to me, and to anybody who's a householder, is a violent crime. And nonviolent crimes, mostly people don't go to prison unless they are repeated offenders in violent crimes. You don't go to prison for the first car theft or the first joyride. It's very rare if that happens. So I would say that now a number of experiments are being carried out in states like Texas and many others. I'm part of a Smart on Crime organization that's trying a lot of experiments to see whether probation or rehabilitation programs or restorative justice programs where people work to pay back people that they've damaged, things like that. And I think it's going to be interesting to see the outcome. So far, it seems to be working in some cases. But I think, again, it's not a panacea, but it does work in some cases. But I think to understand why people go to prison, they usually go to prison in the overwhelming majority of people in prison and state prisons are there for violent crimes. Also, the majority of people in prison, in the federal prison, are for more serious crimes. And so, but I think there are some people that can receive other types of sentences. I think they should, but particularly if a person is a multiple car thief or a person who is a multiple burglar, you just can't keep letting them out, or if they violate their probation, keep letting them out. And so most of the people that are in prison, or put it the other way around, there are very few people. First of all, there are almost no people in prison who didn't commit a crime for which they should be there. And secondly, most of the people are there for either serious crimes or repetitive crimes. It's not easy to get to prison, believe me. Okay, take this one and then that one.
General Meese, Stephen Whitmer. It is very clear in retrospect that the Ferguson Police Department had within 24 hours substantial information suggesting the falsity of the narrative that Officer Darren Wilson had simply murdered an unarmed citizen. They sat on that information. And it is a traditional practice of police agencies to release very little information until an investigation is complete. But they sat on that information as the tension ratcheted up and as this violence grew and as parts of the city were set on fire. In retrospect, how do you think the events in Ferguson should inform police agency policies for dealing with the media in this context?
Very good question, and in fact, it is correct. Now, police officers are often caught in the middle between the lawyers for the district attorney's office saying, don't release any information, it might prejudice our case if it's released now, and what you say, it is possible that revealing the facts of a particular situation to the public may help to stop some of the rioting or the protest. And I think that the best thing to do, and indeed we've had examples, just as in Ferguson they kept the information to themselves, even the name of the police officer, as I remember, to what's going on in Madison, Wisconsin right now, where there was a similar shooting with the same racial situation involved and all the rest, where the chief of police has revealed the name of the officer and all the facts literally within hours of the incident taking place, making that public. And I think that'll be an interesting case to follow to see how that all develops. My own idea is that the police should reveal as much information as they possibly can, particularly when they're sure that that is in fact the factual information. Much of the information, often in many criminal situations, are things where you have to have lab tests, you have to have fingerprint identification, you have to have criminalistics and other things such as that, where you don't have the information right away, or so that you can't. The last thing they want to do is speculate or provide information that turns out to be untrue, because then they're accused of falsifying information. So it's not an easy question to make. A decision to make in many cases, but where it's possible, particularly to take away myth, to take away rumor, the police should reveal as much information as possible, just so long as they don't in any way hurt the ultimate prosecution of the case. And so it takes good cooperation between the district attorney's office and the police, with the understanding that part of the motivation and part of the basis for making those decisions is to prevent the protest. Now, I think in the case of Ferguson, it would have been very hard for the police to get that out in time. It might have helped on the second or third day. It would have been very hard to get it out in time on the first day because of the myth, the lie that I talked about. But a part of that, of course, is for the police, when there's no incident going on, working with the public so that the police have the trust and the confidence of the community, which enables them then, when the information can be revealed as much as they can, that people trust that information and as a result use it for beneficial purposes. Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you for your speech. My name is Alex Zajic. I wanted to go back to the point that you were brought up about the history of incarceration rates in the U.S. from the 60s to the 80s. And I thought that was really the most important, or the most interesting part of your speech, because I was looking at the incarceration rates per capita, and I'm sure that you've seen these numbers, but the U.S. has the highest per capita incarceration rate in the world. On a per 100,000 basis, it's 716, and the closest countries that follow in, the closest significant countries that follow in after us are the Russian Federation, Thailand, and Cuba, which all operate at around 470, 510, whereas the U.S. is roughly 50% more than that. You brought up how increased incarceration was responsible for a decrease in crime. Yep. What policy do you believe the U.S. should take? Should we increase incarceration on violent crime and decrease it on drug-related offenses? Should we increase it on everything? What is your stance? Thanks.
Well, my thought is we should, that's why they use this term smart on crime. I think that obviously if less than 10% of criminals are going to prison, that you're not properly using incarceration under that sort of thing. Your judges are not doing their duty. So I think it depends not on a particular percentage or a particular number. It should depend upon policies so that where a person can reasonably be rehabilitated or stopped from committing crimes without going to prison, which means, first of all, a willingness to admit guilt when they are guilty and to go through some sort of sentencing that is appropriate, whether being put on probation or something like that. I think where that's useful, whether that works out, that ought to be used as much as possible. There are also, in certain hardship cases, there ought to be safety valves for judges to not have to comply with mandatory minimums, for example, when there is a legitimate reason to depart from those, so that judges' hands are not tied so they can do a job of judging and not just be a kind of on a cash register basis of incarcerating people. On the other hand, there are some cases where if people prove, either by the severity of the crime, the violence, or what else that it is involved, sometimes the amount of money that's involved, that just punishment itself requires that they serve time in prison, or if they are repeat offenders and where they have indicated that they can't be allowed in public without committing more crimes, then of course that ought to be then they have to be incarcerated. But I think the present programs that are being experimented with, as long as very careful and honest recording and honest accountability is maintained, I think it'll be interesting to see to what extent that can be done in a nonviolent crime, or for that matter, in drug crimes. But a lot of the information that's being put out on these subjects is not accurate information, or it's misunderstood information. For example, people say, we've got so many people in prison for the simple possession of drugs. Well, that's not true. Almost nobody goes to prison for simple possession of drugs. Almost all the people that go to prison for drug use or drug possession are people who have been caught trafficking in drugs, selling drugs, or having drugs for purposes of sale, and then they've pled guilty by pleading down to a lower included offense. So it's a more complex subject than most of the newspapers and even TV programs like that have portrayed. But I think there is room for experimentation. The goal has to be reduction of crime, however. And so you had one extreme in the 1960s and 70s. If we've gone beyond what's necessary to correct that situation now, I think experimented to see what might be done. But again, with crime prevention being the objective, as well as rehabilitation of those offenders who can be rehabilitated. Have we exhausted the questions? One more, okay? Sure.
One more, thank you. You mentioned earlier that you thought that the Department of Justice report had been very well done.
The report on Darren Wilson, yes.
Okay. I was wondering, you know, part of what raised a lot of rhetoric was the Justice report about the inherent racial bias that they found in communities. And I know you spoke extensively about better arming and supporting the police, but I was wondering if you could address a little bit of what we can do about that inherent racial bias that seems to keep popping up everywhere that we look.
Yeah, the Department of Justice report on that aspect, on the Ferguson Police Department, has come under a lot of criticism, particularly for their misuse of statistics in that report. So I think the department's report, now there's definite anecdotal evidence that they found some things in the Ferguson Police Department, emails that ridiculed certain racial groups and things like that, and those clearly have no place in law enforcement and are indications that there was some lack of discipline within the department. On the other hand, trying to extrapolate from statistical information, much of what I saw in the report has some real questions about whether that's an accurate conclusion to draw from the statistical information, because much of it was not hard facts as much as it was their conclusions based upon certain statistical data. So I think that the report probably has some value, but is not definitive, in my opinion, in terms of what they use statistics for in terms of the racial situation, the racial bias. Now, undoubtedly, as I say, there was some part of that in Ferguson, and that there was a community that certainly had that perception in Ferguson. But what I'm saying is that the report itself is not conclusive, as far as I'm concerned, on the statistical data that they used.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meese.